The treasure of Moctezuma, king of the Aztecs. Over $10 million worth of gold dust and gold bars, silver ornaments and shields, gold plates and cuirasses, and pendants and bracelets studded with emeralds, rubies, and great pearls. Cortez had heard stories of the Aztecs' treasure and was determined to conquer Mexico and take the treasure back to Spain. Oddly enough, his conquest of Mexico was to be a great deal easier than he had anticipated, since Moctezuma and his people believed that their white god, Quetzalcoatl, would come to them in person in that very year of Cortez's arrival. And so, in their minds, Cortez was Quetzalcoatl. As a god, they could deny him nothing. It was only later that they knew Cortez and his men were human, with all the human failings. The Aztecs welcomed their god and invited him into the royal palace with his men. And so it happened that the wealth of the Aztecs, their great national treasury, fell into the hands of Cortez and his conquistadors, bloodlessly, without strife or pillage, or a scratch on one Aztec or Spaniard. No, the pillage and the killing was to come later. It began, as these things often seem to, in politics, in this case, in the court of Spain. Cortez had his enemies, no doubt of that, and apparently they persuaded the king to send Panfilo Narvaez to bring Cortez back to Spain. When Cortez heard that her captain Narvaez had landed at Veracruz with orders for his arrest, he was far from happy about it. He consulted with his officers, and it was decided that 1/3 of his men would remain here in the palace, and that the other 2/3 would ride for Veracruz to see if this upstart captain would like a taste of conquistador steel. However, here he made a monumental mistake. To command the 1/3 of his men remaining at the palace, he appointed Pedro de Alvarado, a brash and hot-headed officer, a man who was to prove to the Aztecs that no Spaniard was a god. While Cortez was gone, this Alvarado watched worriedly as a mob of Aztecs danced in the courtyard of the palace. He himself had given the Indians permission to celebrate a feast, honoring one of their gods. However, Alvarado lost his head completely at the sight of so many Aztec warriors. What the history of the Aztecs, or of Mexico itself as far as that goes, might have been if he had not given his men orders to attack the innocents in the courtyard, boggles the imagination. But he did, and the slaughter began. It was none of Cortez's doings, but it's safe to say that from that moment onward, no Aztec trusted a Spaniard, much less thought him a god. It was the beginning of the end for the Aztecs, but the beginning of a brief time of pure hell for the conquistadors. Cortez finally returned from his defeat of Narvaez, and he made no bones about telling Alvarado that what he had done was a great mistake, an ill-done thing, as he put it. But the damage was done. Now the fighting began. Indian against Spaniard, wooden lance against steel sword, arrow against crossbow bolt. From rooftops in the streets, the Aztecs poured arrows and hand-thrown darts and stones from their slings. Spanish horsemen, Spanish musketeers, Spanish crossbowmen, falling under the hail. But for every Spaniard, 10, 20 unarmored Aztecs fighting with wooden weapons fell. For Cortés, Moctezuma was his last hope. But even this lord of the Aztecs, standing on a rooftop and begging his people to stop fighting, was wounded by a barrage of stones from Aztec slings and died a few days later. The fighting continued for several days. It was obvious to the Spaniards that they were trapped in the palace. Bridges over the canals had been torn down by the Indians, and the causeway across the lake could not be reached. Nevertheless, they needed to get out of the city. They began building a portable bridge to get over the canals. They would fight their way through the streets to the causeway, then down the causeway to the lake shore and safety. One last thing, the Aztecan national treasury they had found earlier, sealed up in a secret room of Montezuma's palace. The conquistadores were simply incapable of leaving it behind them. Again they broke open the sealed door, and Cortés gave each soldier permission to carry as much gold as he could. And yet, when they had done this, so much treasure was left that it seemed as though none at all had been taken. Now began what conquistadores would always call Noche Triste, sorrowful night. Horses slipping on the bloody streets, the press of screaming Aztecs all around them. These men in heavy armor dragging their portable bridge forward as they gained ground. Soldiers falling into a canal, and the weight of the gold so heavy they could hardly stand up and walk with it, quickly dragging them down to their deaths beneath the blood-colored water. The stench of blood from torn open bodies, and the cries of pain and agony from Indian and conquistador alike was to echo in the ears and minds of those who survived this sorrowful night until the end of their days. At last, only one canal remained between the conquistadores and the causeway, and now that canal was so choked with the bodies of Aztec and Spaniard alike that the bridge was left behind unneeded. At last the causeway and room to fight and breathe, and ground gained more easily now. At last, the land and blessed safety of the lake shore was reached. Behind them, in the streets and canals of Tenochtitlan, the conquistadores left 860 comrades killed, or if alive and captured, to be sacrificed to the Aztec gods. And the conquistadores' chronicles are not ashamed to say that their captain, Hernando Cortés, wept for them on Noche Triste.